This is not a recent problem. This is a problem that's been brewing for some time. And companies, let's say large multinational companies, haven't actually done their homework on this. And the problem that's been brewing for some time is really, I would put it under the heading of a globalization and a fragmentation of the value chain. So therefore, the boundaries of what the company does within its own let's say walls, in terms of the corporate walls, corporate boundary, is diminishing, and companies are engaging in more and more outsourcing. And there are well accepted reasons for that. The second thing that's happening is that as you engage in more outsourcing, actually also it's offshore outsourcing to other countries. And then, of course, you may have a tier 1 supplier in China, and then the tier 1 would have a number of tier 2 suppliers, and the tier 2 would have an even larger number of tier 3 suppliers. And so, for instance, let's say you have a toy or a candy that is sold in the US market. And, and of course, ultimately, at some point, it's a small shop that's making some kind of paint supplying to a bigger manufacturer, or a small farmer supplying milk to some kind of a distribution center. And so this whole thing about fragmentation and a geographic dispersion of the value chain, that's a process that's been going on for about 20 years. And I think what companies haven't done in the process is to say that when you have, let's say, 1,000 different players entering the economic system, which let's call it your company's value chain or your business's value chain, then in fact any contamination, any problem anywhere in that system is ultimately, if you are the seller of the end product, it's going to come back and bite you. Now, there are two ways, to the extent that the customer is not going to tolerate it and the society is not going to tolerate it, you have only two choices. Either, of course, you say, well, we are not going to fragment the value chain and we are going to do everything within our walls, but that may be economically simply infeasible. A second possibility, and which is what should have been done, and I believe that's going to get done, is that companies will have to basically say, even though I may not own an operation that's done by a tier 3 supplier or a tier 4 supplier, but I'm responsible for making sure that what I'm getting or what's entering the value chain is in fact up to the quality that I want. And increasingly companies are finding you cannot just trust a tier 1 supplier and say, well, we leave it to them. That would be basically like Nike saying, look, I don't manufacture shoes in Vietnam or Indonesia. My contractor does it for me, and so therefore I can close my eyes with respect to labor conditions. You can't. You're still responsible for it. And I think what will happen, either companies will figure out monitoring procedures, but even more importantly and most likely, I think what will happen is the emergence of a third party, just like third party logistics. I already know of some companies founded by Western entrepreneurs, Australians, Americans in China, that are third-party monitors. And just like third-party logistics, they only specialize. They live in China, they're based in China, they're Westerners, and they know, in fact, what the Western company wants. And what they have is an army of people, and whose only job is to monitor the entire supply chain on site. And they do it for multiple companies so they can have economies of scale and scope and competence. So therefore, let's say a candy manufacturer in the US doesn't have to build that army of monitors. It can essentially outsource that activity, but outsource that activity to a group of people who specialize in that process. I think that's the solution that we are likely to see.